Hello and welcome to the launch of the State of European Tech 2021. I'm Tom Wehmeier from Atomico, report co-author and your co-host for today.
And I'm Sarah Guemouri, co-author of the report and co-host for today, and we're both joining you live from London.
This is now the 7th year of this report, but our goal remains the same: to capture a snapshot of the European tech ecosystem and showcase the amazing founders and teams creating immense value through breakthrough innovations all across the continent. By charting progress, we're seeking to highlight the scale of the opportunity in Europe, as well as spark new ideas about how to fully realise European tech's potential. Since its inception, we've become accustomed to breaking records, and 2021 did not disappoint. But there was one notable difference this year: the scale and pace of the growth. It truly is like nothing we've ever seen. Both in terms of value creation and investment, it's been a watershed year. The other job of this report is to help us better understand the people within the tech community and the issues that make them tick. Today, you will hear a range of voices, from the CEO of Europe's most valuable private tech company to the first female founder of a tech unicorn in Europe, to a former gang leader turned community activist, entrepreneur and investor, who's now at the forefront of an effort to create opportunity for Black founders. We'll hear vivid examples of the European tech flywheel in action, where success creates the conditions for future success, as well as exploring some of the most meaningful challenges facing European tech. This is the most comprehensive report we've ever conducted, and the conversations it's inspired are truly memorable. Now, before we get into the data, I want to acknowledge all the people who make this report possible. To the survey distribution partners and the more than 5,000 members of the community who lent their voice to our survey, making it our largest yet. To our panel of more than 60 industry leaders who shared their expert analysis in the report. And to our data partners who shared their invaluable data sets with us. And our report partners, Slush, Oric, Silicon Valley Bank, and Baillie Gifford. Thank you. And with that, let me hand over to Sarah.
Thanks, Tom, and a huge thanks from me to all our partners. 2021 was a groundbreaking year for European tech on several fronts, affirming its position as a global tech player. But first, the headline number. We're set to cross the milestone of $100 billion invested in a single year. To put that into perspective, this is 10 times the level we were excited about when we launched our first report back in 2015, when $10 billion were invested in the ecosystem. Things are moving so fast, we can hardly keep count. We hit our print deadline with 98 new unicorns, and then 2 more followed the very next day, taking us to a nice round 100. The total value of public and private European tech companies is now well over $3 trillion, and yet growth is still accelerating. So how did we get to 100 billion? Well, in short, we've seen the pace of investment break records every single month this year. By the end of November, we had already hit $94 billion. So with 1 month still to go and the impact of reporting lag, we expect to end up closer to $120 billion when all has been counted. This leap forward is driven largely by mega rounds. Indeed, rounds of more than $100 million are up 10x from just 5 years ago. They've arrived on a daily basis this year, barely taking the weekends off. This growth also comes from a deeper pool of investors than we've ever seen. US investors are more active than ever, participating in 28% of all deals, up almost 10 percentage points from just 2 years ago. And the presence of certain crossover investors cannot have escaped anybody's attention. Hardly surprising given they participated in 1/3 of all mega rounds. This helped funnel more capital into the top 2 quartiles of countries. Europe's most mature markets disproportionately attracted these larger rounds, resulting in huge leaps in countries like the UK, France, or Germany. Dozens of countries across Europe are still at the very start of their journey. So we're not even close to reaching the full potential of Europe as a whole. But the potential is absolutely here. You just have to look at where great success stories are emerging from. Founders have built billion-dollar companies from almost 100 cities across 28 countries. Great companies truly can come from anywhere in Europe. Europe also broke records on the unicorn front, and it's not just the frequency, but the magnitude that's changed. We have now produced 40 decacorns across both public and private markets. 26 of those are VC-backed, compared to just 12 last year. And we've also arrived at the era of European big tech. ASML is valued over $300 billion, while Adyen looks set to become Europe's first VC-backed $100 billion company. With compounding businesses and massive markets to address, they still have so much upside ahead of them. 2021 has also been a watershed year for liquidity. Across M&As, IPOs, direct listings, and even SPACs, Europe Tech saw a combined $275 billion in exit value. And more than half of that came from venture-backed companies. Exits are a healthy feature of a functioning market, not a bug. And this level of liquidity, both in terms of talents and capital, is vital for European tech success. So it won't be a surprise to anybody that we've seen rising valuations across all stages. At both the early and late stages, they have taken another jump. And though there remain big differences between prices in Europe and in the US, which says a lot, given the eye-popping numbers we've been seeing here recently. But looking at the median valuation doesn't really tell the full story. If we look at the top quartile as a proxy for what's happened in the most attractive and most contested opportunities, pricing levels look very different. In fact, almost 3x the market average. 40 million seed rounds, 100 million Series A's, and billion-dollar Series B's have arrived here in Europe too. European tech is creating value faster than ever, and looking back at the trajectory so far is quite remarkable. It took a long, multi-decades journey to hit the first $1 trillion in ecosystem value, and that milestone was only reached 3 years ago, in December 2018. The second trillion followed in 24 months. And this year, the third trillion arrived in just 8 months. That's $3 million of value created every single minute. Of course, it's not lost on the industry that this has happened against an unprecedented macro backdrop. Both VCs and LPs cite inflation, interest rates, and public market sentiment as the biggest risk in tech over the coming years. Tech has never been more attractive during a period when growth and yield has been otherwise hard to find. But what happens if this changes is clearly top of mind for the region's investors.
But the shorter-term cycles of the markets should not detract from longer-term structural trends. Irrespective of what happens with macro, European tech success is powered by two important tailwinds. First, the relentless march of technology that is transforming every aspect of the economy and society. And second, the virtuous cycle that has been firmly set in motion that we call the European tech flywheel. And this is systematically recycling talent, capital, and know-how back into the ecosystem, ensuring success breeds more success. So let's break down the different pieces and start with talent. This year, we've commissioned new data sets to better understand talent trends, including working with Dealroom to build a snapshot of tens of thousands of current European tech founders and senior leaders. And one thing we wanted to better understand is just how much talent is being recycled from one generation of companies to the next. Is this idea of a talent flywheel real? And the answer is absolutely. 38% of the founders and leaders in our sample have experience working for 2 or more companies from both newer and more established generations of tech companies. And 19% of them have experience working at a European unicorn. Now this matters because it's how knowledge, networks, know-how are passed from one generation to the next. It's how that experience of building and scaling companies is paid forward, and how companies learn to execute better and faster against bigger ideas with bolder ambitions. We've also mapped unicorn mafias with greater precision than ever before, identifying almost 6,000 founders that have started companies having previously worked for a European unicorn. The top 15 unicorns alone have more than 2,000 alumni founders. That's an average of more than 130 each. And what's even more exciting is the best is yet to come. Unicorns founded in the past decade count for 44% of the total count, and yet they only make up 25% of today's alumni founders. In other words, the full potential of today's unicorn offspring has yet to be realized. And what compounds that optimism is seeing that European tech companies are getting better with each vintage. More recently founded companies reach unicorn status faster than any prior generation. For example, the class of 2000 took 6 years to produce its first unicorn, and then only delivered 1 more during the whole of the first 10 years. By contrast, the class of 2015 already has 16 unicorns among them, and only 6 years have elapsed so far. So, not only do we have founders and operators with the best credentials and execution capability, we also have the strongest pipeline of early-stage companies we've ever seen. Remarkably, Europe now has a share of global early-stage funding that is on par with the US, having rapidly caught up over the past decade. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about unprecedented capital flows, but before we move on, we want to make one thing clear. Raising capital is never easy, and access remains unequally distributed. 18% of founders say it's actually become harder to raise capital this year compared to last, and another 40% feel nothing has changed. And this is felt disproportionately by underrepresented founders. Female founders are 2 times more likely than white men to say it's become much harder to fundraise. And founders from ethnic minorities are 3 times more likely to say that same thing. This is also reflected in fundraising data. We partnered with Extend Ventures to create what is the first ever European-wide snapshot on funding to ethnic minority founding teams and leadership. And the data is sobering. Just 11% of capital invested in the companies in our sample to date went to founding teams and executives from ethnic minority groups. And only 1.8% of the total raised to date by these companies has been captured by black founders. Capital, and therefore the ability to bring new ideas to life, has been overwhelmingly allocated to one group of people. And beyond doing the right thing, expanding the total addressable market for talent and ideas is the only way to keep up with tech employment growth. While European employment as a whole has grown by 0.4% over the past 24 months, tech startup and scale-up employment has grown by 19.4%. That's a 50x difference. And so, as this search for tech talent intensifies, it is becoming more of a bottleneck, alongside ever-present challenges around funding and regulation. Europe needs to do everything in its power to meet this demand for talent, not least creating a policy landscape that is more favourable in this regard. And in the meantime, as they always do, founders are taking things into their own hands. Our survey shows they're doubling down on remote roles, opening up positions in new locations, and increasing their focus on purpose and values. Employee share ownership plans are also crucial, and while there's real progress on this front, there's still some way to go. The Not Optional campaign, which is raising awareness of the issue and seeking to change Europe's policies that govern employee ownership, is a necessary and important step. We're also encouraged by the share of talented women leading today's European tech companies, especially amongst the younger generations. For leaders in tech with less than 5 years' experience, women make up a much higher proportion at 29%. It's great that younger cohorts of leaders are more gender diverse, but to address our talent shortages, we'll need to get these numbers even higher and retain them in the industry long term.
So let's now take a look at how this generation of more experienced talent is shaping an exciting path for European tech. There's certainly no limit to the ambitions of Europe's boldest founders. Europe is a launch pad for moonshots. From nuclear fusion to electric jet airliners, from carbon capture to green steel and biochemicals, we see European founders taking on the hardest problems known to humanity. We are also seeing them play defining roles in shaping the development of Web3. Crypto investment is up 5x, and Europe has already seen 8 crypto unicorns emerge, with 5 this year alone. Europe's crypto OGs have navigated many cycles and are seeing the rewards for their conviction and patience. Zooming out, fintech remains a dominant theme in European tech. The region's fintech companies have raised almost $22 billion in just the first 9 months of 2021. And perhaps unsurprisingly, enterprise software saw surging growth too, with investment at more than $12 billion over the same time period, which is double the amount raised over the whole of last year. Purpose and impact are also top of the agenda. Investment in companies addressing key social and environment challenges soared again in 2021. In fact, Europe now has the largest share of capital invested in early-stage purpose-driven tech companies on a global basis, accounting for 61% of all funding at pre-seed and seed stages. Planet positive is the most common focus amongst these, which is not surprising given both the scale and urgency of the climate crisis. And it's not just founders who want to do good. 80% of all tech employee respondents to our survey said impact is such an important consideration when choosing where to work.
As you can see, this year we've made huge leaps in fintech, deep tech, climate tech, crypto, and much more. And these bolder and better companies are attracting more world-class investors and helping to drive exceptional returns. European VCs delivered truly stellar performance this year. But more impressive is the fact that they have outperformed US peers for the past 2 decades. Whether you look back over a 1, 3, 5, 10, 15, or 20-year horizon, European VC is the star performer. And they've also massively outperformed the European Buyout Index for the past 15 years now. Yet, in spite of this, institutional investor allocations to VC remain tiny. For every dollar invested in European VC by pension funds, $19 are allocated to buyout funds. In fact, the region's pension funds allocation to VC barely hit $1 billion per year. So that's just 0.018% of their more than $3 trillion of assets under management. And this raises important questions. Are they placing a right-sized, risk-adjusted bet on the future? Are enough Europeans capturing the value from European tech success? So, with a deeper and more experienced talent pool, the strongest ever pipeline of startups, better and bolder ideas, world-class investors, we've created a strong flywheel in Europe. And the result is outcomes that exceed expectations in both the public and private markets. We've seen $100 billion of M&A value this year, including the $8 billion sale of Wolt to DoorDash, and $110 billion from public listings, including a record $11 billion direct listing by Wise. And we finally saw SPACs arrive in Europe in a meaningful way, bringing with them another $62 billion of deal value across 15 completed processes. European tech has never seen bigger outcomes, and founders have never had more options to find liquidity. But having said all of this, there's still huge upside potential in European tech. Europe's a vast economic powerhouse. It accounts for 22% of global GDP, just behind the US. It accounts for 19% of all public equity value outside of tech. But Europe's not punching at anywhere close to that weight in technology yet. It accounts for just 7% of aggregate global tech market cap. That's a fraction of the 71% share held by North America. It's clear there's still tremendous room to grow. So let's come full circle and look at what we might expect for the next decade. You can't predict the future, of course, but we can and we should try to understand the direction of travel. The 10x growth in the value of the European tech ecosystem since 2010 translates to a compound annual growth rate of 23%. And that in itself is impressive. But even that's surpassed if you just look at what's happened since 2015. Growth has accelerated since then to 35%. And keeping in mind that outcomes have always exceeded our expectations so far, there's every reason to believe to expect future growth to beat on the upside in the long term too. And whichever way you model it, whether you go highly conservative or not, we're going to see trillions of dollars of value created by technology over the course of the next decade in Europe.
Thanks, Dom. I know we've shared a lot of data, but we've really only scratched the surface of what's in the report. In fact, we have more than 400 charts in there and over 100 quotes from the industry's most insightful and influential voices reflecting on this groundbreaking year for European tech. So please don't forget to check it out after today's event at www.stateofeuropeantech.com. And to commemorate the year Europe smashed all expectations, and to say thank you to the SOET community who every year makes time to take the survey and contributes to one of our core dataset that informs the report, we commissioned 10 State of European Tech NFTs from Amser Studio. And we will be giving them to 10 lucky winners who help spread the survey far and wide. So drum roll please, and let's have a look at the first State of European Tech NFT collection. It was only fitting to give you all a piece of our very own European Tech Flywheel, given it underpins the success we have had this year in European Tech. You can go and check the full collection by scanning the QR code, but I just couldn't resist showing you two of my favorite ones.
I have to say they look absolutely beautiful, and what a fitting way to commemorate 2021. Congratulations to all of the winners. We will be in touch with you after the event. And we'd now like to introduce Chris Grew from Oric, who will deliver a few words before we get stuck into the conversations.
Hi, I'm Chris Grew, a partner at tech law firm Oric. In the 5 years that Oric has been supporting the State of European Tech, we've seen the amount of investment grow exponentially. And again, this growth trajectory continues with new record levels of investment this year. At the same time, it's been an absolute joy to witness the report evolve into a platform for everybody united by a common drive to contribute to European tech success. And this year is no exception. Here are a few key trends that Oric has seen this past year. First, Europe is experiencing the strongest pipeline of early-stage investment. Second, European startup market is putting up remarkable results across the company lifecycle spectrum. Rapid investment and big exits are now the norm for Europe. Thirdly, the European tech ecosystem is marching to the beat of its own drum, gaining significant ground internationally with unprecedented investment volume and valuation growth. And finally, as the report is now recognized as the industry benchmark, we're also happy to see it continue to highlight issues we all need to address collectively, especially diversity, equality, and inclusion. These are extremely exciting times to be part of the European tech and venture ecosystem, and honestly, Oric could not be more proud to be part of that. We hope you enjoy the show. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Now, let's go to Helsinki, Finland, where Mika Huutonen, the CEO of Slush, who've been our partner since the very inception of this report, will introduce our first discussion.
Hi, and welcome to Helsinki. I'm Mika, CEO at Slush. And for those who don't know, Slush is a not-for-profit organization with the mission to create and help founders to change the world. The thing that we are maybe the most known of is our annual event held in Helsinki around November and December. I think some of you visited Slush last week, but for those who didn't, I hope to see you next year in 2022. Slush has partnered up with Atomico for the State of the European Tech ever since the day one in 2015. We think that it's absolutely necessary to build the data infrastructure to understand where we are in Europe and where we should head next. Talking about that, the next discussion is incredibly important, not just only for me, but also for the Finnish ecosystem around. The next discussion will be moderated by maybe the most well-known Finnish entrepreneur, Ilkka Paananen, co-founder and CEO of Supercell. And with Ilkka, he's joined by not just only one, but actually 3 former Slush CEOs. Miki Kuusi, co-founder and CEO of Wolt, COO Riku Mäkelä, and the VP of New Markets, Marianne Veikkola. And one of the reasons why this discussion is so special for me is that these 3 people have defined the ambition level for me and for many others over and over again. When I was 19, I looked up to these people when they were building Slush, and now after the success of Wolt, they once again defined the ambition level to new heights, and they continue to inspire me to build different things in the future. I hope you enjoy the discussion.
Hello, my name is Ilkka Paananen. I'm the CEO and founder of Supercell. And I'm here in Helsinki at the Wolt headquarters, together with 3 very special people. Miki Kuusi, who's the CEO and founder, Riku Mäkelä, the COO, and Marianne Veikkola, VP of New Markets. So I want to start with an obvious question. You guys just announced a massive deal whereby DoorDash acquires Wolt. The value of the deal is 7 billion euros. Has that sunk in yet?
I don't really think so. We've been working incredibly hard over these last 7 years, and even more so in the last few months and weeks leading up to this point. So it kind of feels like we've had this very tall mountain we've been climbing over these years, and whenever you've gotten to a milestone, whether it's like raising an A round of 10 million or C round of 100 million or a 7 billion euro exit, when you get to the top of the mountain, you're like, we worked so hard to get here, and we were looking at this point and thinking and dreaming that maybe one day we could get there. And once you get there, it's kind of like, we're here, but there's a new mountain, and we're only getting started on that one. So I don't think it really has sunk in yet. And there's a Zen Buddhist saying I like, which goes that before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. So that's kind of how I feel like at the moment.
Marianne, how do you feel?
I mean, can only echo. Few very, very hectic weeks behind. It's been an amazing journey, but it will continue being so. So we're not going anywhere.
Riku?
Well, I think anybody that's been in the position of perhaps like not that type of sale, but like a big financing event or something knows that it's a bit of work to get across the line, the actual sort of hours you have to put in, and I think that kind of hinders your ability to see the situation when it's actually done. So I think we're still in that kind of mode and sort of processing it, but I think it's starting to sink in slowly.
You get to the goal, it's good to celebrate, it's good to feel good about it, but the reality is that on Monday you go back to work and you have another mountain to climb.
So what makes the 3 of you very special in addition to Wolt is that all 3 of you guys have been the CEOs of Slush, the big tech conference that's happening here in Helsinki. So you sort of bring a very unique perspective in a sense that you've been the CEOs of Slush, and then you built Wolt to where it is today. So what type of role did that experience sort of has played in how you think about your careers and then also like how you thought about scaling Wolt?
Building Slush was a fantastic experience for both as a CEO and as an entrepreneur. Because we were this bootstrapped operation without any financing, being able to pay our salaries if we had made enough partnerships and ticket sales in the month. Ultimately taking a lot of risk to build something where we, in the years I was running Slush, we tripled every year. And as an event, it basically means that you're tripling your cost base and trusting that you will get the revenue in the months to come to actually pay for that cost base. So I think it was this kind of an experience that molded all three of us as leaders when it comes to how you build something from nothing and how you kind of lead something through very demanding times.
And see what world class looks like, as nothing like that had been built before. You had to just figure out what does the best in class look like when you don't know what the best in class is.
Rick, what would you say? What was the most important lesson you learned through Slush experience that you've applied at Wolt?
To take an individual lesson would be rather difficult. I think what I'll say first is like one of the things we're going to talk about today is sort of these network effects, these flywheel effects, if we call them that, of kind of people having success or learning from one thing and then going to apply to the next thing. And that's what I always thought Slush was. It was a school. And by the way, it wasn't a school for the three of us. It was a school for thousands of people and still remains a school for thousands of people. And all those people are going to go on to do really great things. Hopefully, actually, I'm fairly certain of it that they will. But that's the number one thing. What would I take away on a concrete level? I think it's a lot of the little things, like sort of first-time manager of 10 people, first-time manager of 50 people, screwing something up, doing big mistakes in hiring, doing successful hiring, like all the kind of fundamentals you need to do in building a company. You, through Slush, had to do a little bit too early on in your career, which meant that you could do those mistakes early on enough to where then you can sort of correct them quite quickly, if that makes sense.
So you obviously started Wolt, here in Helsinki, Finland, but since then you've expanded to dozens and dozens of countries and been super successful, like growing your business also outside Finland. So what would be the main lessons that you could share with our entrepreneurs looking to do the same?
Yeah, I think one thing that has been like an elemental thing of building Wolt since the start was that we always had a big vision for what we wanted to do, like a big market. We saw that there's going to be, like, the world is going online. That's what's happening. And I was thinking that, how are the cities going to go online? And I figured that, local services, shops, boutiques, restaurants, they're going to end up online one way or another. So we had this kind of big vision, big market to work off with. But then you need to have like the first step and the second step and the third step. And these steps need to be very small, that you can see that step by step by step, if you take hundreds and thousands of steps, you can ultimately end up towards the vision. And I think finding that balance between having a massive market, massive opportunity, big vision, but ultimately, we were a takeaway service for 10 restaurants in Helsinki back in 2015. So you need to get started somewhere. And I think finding the balance between those two things is very, very important. I think in Wolt's journey, what you can find is that like we were always super focused on, on the customer, building the best possible service for the customer, building the best possible product to be able to get there, to be able to do this in environments where it's difficult, to have an amazing customer experience because population density or income disparity or these kind of things that make last mile delivery easy in some markets. That's not the case in our markets. So we need to find efficiency through technology and our culture. But I think this balance between, big vision, step by step getting there, and also finding niches in a big market. Like, our market is one of the biggest markets in the world. You don't need to win the US to build a massive company. And, for us, we kind of saw that, people eat everywhere. And, most of the people in most of the countries don't have a service like the service that we were building. So we kind of figured that, we might not have the biggest war chest, but we're going to be very efficient when it comes to creating value for as many customers as possible in all different parts of the world. And today we operate in 23 countries.
So Marianne, you've led this expansion. What advice would you give to somebody who's looking to do the same?
Yeah, Miki told well about the market opportunity, but then obviously this is a business of execution. And we've been always a company about doing common things uncommonly well. So really excelling at the things you really need to excel, be it in customer experience, in recruiting, in team building, leadership, doing the common things uncommonly well. And a practical example could be maybe recruiting. When we go to a completely new market where we've never been before, you have to go and get the people. Like, no one's going to apply. Go and hunt the people down you need and go after them. Like, you need to run. And that applies to all the new things when you go to a new market. Like, just get your hands dirty.
So what do you do in practice? You go to LinkedIn and browse for people, or? Literally
that. Then use accounts of people that have the most power to look influential, have calls with them, pitch them. It's a sales story, right? Yeah. Just like you would be selling a service you've built. You're selling the company to the candidate, and that has to take as long as the candidate is convinced that, okay, this is an opportunity I want to pursue, and then you switch to a mode of okay, is this person someone we want to work with actually?
So as a board member of Wolt, like one of the things I was most impressed with, and I remember you and I having discussion about the expansion to Japan, which obviously like feels like an extremely difficult thing to do, and there's a very small number of like companies in the Western world who've even been able to do that. But you guys been like surprisingly successful there. So did the exact same lessons like apply to Japan?
Ultimately, yeah. We need to find the best people, and we need to find them literally. No one's going to come to us, especially in Japan, where the brand is not at all known. Beyond that, identify the best restaurants in our business model. So basically, what makes your platform local, and that's all about this business. It's not even cities, it's neighborhoods. So you need to be there on the ground to really understand what the customers want and what makes sense in Hiroshima or Sapporo or Tokyo. And there's no way you can do that only by being in Helsinki.
So Riku, you obviously have played a key role in the kind of birth of the State of European Tech report. Like, tell us, like, how did that come about, and especially, I was asked you to ask you the question, like, where did that happen?
The origin story is a bit weird, and I'll get into it. But the background is like there are a few of these sort of reporting institutions, cool things that come out annually on various sectors and industries that everybody in that space look up to. There's one very well-known one on the internet, for example, and we were kind of like talking about these and thinking like there's a lot going on in Europe all of a sudden, like there hadn't been for decades, if ever, in terms of tech, and suddenly it was coming up, and there were individual pieces of information, like somebody was talking about there being a boom in venture capital and showed some chart of how that was going in a nice direction, and people were talking about talent shortages in different areas of Europe, and there being great hubs for talent in others. And we kind of asked ourselves, like, why is no one putting that together to where you could just sort of see what's going on in European tech by browsing one sort of report or one publication or whatever it may be. And we thought, if we do that consistently for 5 years or 10 years, and we actually were talking of a longer time already at that point, we figured it could maybe become a sort of institution that people refer to when they think of what's going on in tech in Europe. So that was the seed of thought into this. And then what actually happened is we were doing Slush in Tokyo at the time. We had a few international events, and Tom, the head of research at Atomico, he was a speaker at the event, and it's a pretty funny story. There's an actual tent sauna, a very sort of Finnish concept, obviously, brought to the streets of Tokyo. It was an outside event, and for some reason we found ourselves having a drink in the tent sauna with Tom, and we kind of got talking about exactly the things that I just referred to. So, like, why was nobody doing this? It was a great time for tech in Europe, but no one was sort of pulling all the data together and telling everybody what it looks like analytically. Where are things going? We said, why don't we take a stab at that? And of course, the first year, you could argue, was a very handmade version of it, where we tried to find partners that could provide us with information as to what the hell's going on in the first place, and then it kind of matured and went from there. And of course, to be completely fair, I haven't really been involved with this for like 6 years at this point, so it's much better and bigger than we ever imagined at the time. But that was the origin story.
Right, and it was 2015, right? And the first
I believe that was
report.
2015, yes.
Yeah, so I was checking out the report, and I think in that report we were getting super excited about, I think it was like 10 billion being invested into European startups. We had reached, I think, 10 unicorns, like companies valued over $1 billion at that time. How do you think?
I have to say one thing, because I remember when we were doing the first report, there was a page on unicorns in general and some categorization of them, and there were still few enough to where we would put the logos onto a slide to show the ones that exist. And the funny thing is, if you did that today, well, first of all, nobody with a PowerPoint or any other tool would bother to do that, because there's probably hundreds and you wouldn't even find the logos. But there's a few of these sort of anecdotes where it's really easy to see how things have changed over the last half a decade.
So what would you say it has changed, say, from 2015 when the first version of the report came out?
For me, what has changed the most is, it's a bit of a theory to practice matter, right? But like there was a lot of talk back 5 or 6 years ago about like talent availability and how many people wanted to get into startups or growth companies or whatever. And I think especially coming from Helsinki, like it wasn't obvious. It was not an obvious choice for a lot of people, even though there was this supposed boom at the time. But I would still argue it hadn't kind of gone mainstream to where people from more traditional companies that had worked there for 15 or 20 years would seriously be considering taking that leap of faith. I think that's the biggest change. Like you see people coming into growth companies from completely different, almost unimaginable backgrounds sort of 5 years ago. Like you never would have thought those types of people would have come to these types of companies for jobs and been successful, and they definitely are. And to me, that's the biggest change.
Marianne, what's been the biggest change for you?
Absolutely that. On top of it, obviously, availability of capital. It's completely different. Nowadays, I see VCs really competing to get into a round over here, whereas 5 years ago, you were really chasing as an entrepreneur for funding. And usually, there wasn't any available in Finland, in the Nordics, barely in Europe. So massive change.
Yeah, I remember when we raised our first €500,000 round of financing back in 2014. It was a real fight to get that round together in hindsight. And today, and back in the days, like raising a €500,000 round was unheard of, at least in Finland. Like that was a humongous round and crazy valuation for a company that basically was founded a week earlier. But I think like today there's so much more examples that we can build these companies also out of Europe. This is not a Silicon Valley thing anymore. Like we can have global and local champions emerge that were not founded in London. They were not founded even in Berlin. Like they were founded in some place where there was a group of people and talent, and they saw something that they wanted to solve. And I think that power of the internet and how we're not only building global services anymore, but we're building hyperlocal services. Means that there's going to be more and more success stories coming from like unobvious places, and I think that's really the big change. And the power of example is very important in this, because I remember as a kid working at Supercell back in 2012, and that was the crazy year of Rovio and Angry Birds. I remember you said in a meeting that I'll be damned if our ambition is to be the second largest gaming company out of Finland. And I remember because it was a crazy thing to say at the time, because Angry Birds was like this unheard of thing coming out of like Finland and coming out of Europe, that how could anyone build something bigger than that? And that's what you guys did. And I think this kind of power of examples is showing people in Europe that we can build these companies. These companies can come out of here. They can be built by people that don't have to go to Silicon Valley anymore to do this.
It's funny, back in the days, 5-6 years ago, we always were saying like there's something happening in the Nordics or there's something happening in Europe to kind of demystify and start the story of there's a lot of good stuff cooking here, you just don't know about it. And now people do know about it. It's out there.
Definitely changed, yeah.
So Marianne, like Riku already mentioned about this concept, known as the flywheel. So this idea that success creates success. Talk a bit about that. Like, what role? First of all, have you experienced that with Wolt, and if so, how?
Obviously, it's only getting started over here, but we're far ahead where we were 5-10 years ago. Obviously, Supercell and the gaming companies being the first wave, and all the knowledge and also ability to invest further that came from that is now nurturing the second or the third wave, how would you want to put it, of Flywheel over here in the Nordics. And it's not just about the capital and the angels that come about, but also just the knowledge of building these companies. That's even harder than the capital, at least in my opinion.
So to keep that like flywheel going on, like what role will each of the three of you guys play in the next chapter?
I think we'll keep building. Like it's still very early days for our company, still very early days for our industry. What I'm most excited about is that I remember being this like young kid in 2012 working for Supercell back in the days when Supercell was like a 40-person company, and sitting here I kind of recognize everything I got from that journey to be able to do the things that I've done. And my hope is that having over 4,000 people working at Wolt today, that we're going to be able to create as many similar stories as my personal story through the people of Wolt. And ultimately, as Marianne says, it all comes down to people. And I think we as a company, we as individuals, we're ultimately growing people that I think are going to build amazing companies. Today, hopefully continue to build Wolt also for many years, but eventually doing other companies, joining existing companies or founding new companies.
Considering how many people are employed at Wolt, like I don't know, Miki, what your number is, but I would definitely be bummed if the current employees of Wolt didn't start at least 100 companies over the next 5 years. Because we do employ thousands of people, and most people are very entrepreneurially minded. In fact, I think there's already like 5 or 6 that exist that I know of, probably more that I don't know of. and to see that become more than 100 or several hundred, I don't think that's a stretch of imagination by any means.
No. And each of the moments when you see someone from the community, be it a Wolt alumni or a Slush alumni or the wider ecosystem alumni, setting up a company of their own is definitely a moment of like being proud about what we've done so far.
Fantastic. So my favorite piece of this year's report was this data point. I'm going to read it aloud from here. So the report is saying that Europe accounts for 33% of all capital invested globally in rounds of up to $5 million, and we are now on par with the US for the first time. So how important are the early stage investors for you guys, and what advice would you give to a founder who's looking for the best early stage investors?
Yeah, we wouldn't be here without our like early investors like yourself and like a bunch of like other ex-operators and entrepreneurs who've kind of seen what it is like to build a company like this themselves. I think like once companies get to this kind of scale-up phase, it becomes more of like a science of like how you scale up a company and how you build different functions and so forth. And there's a lot of very good professional growth stage investors who know that really well. But when you're in the early stage, like it's not a science, it's an art. And you need like other artists to be able to succeed in that phase. And I think like other people who've gone through the journey kind of understand what it is like to try to have like constrained resources, to be constantly in a place where you're gonna run out of money unless you're able to figure this thing out, how to build amazing product, get amazing customer experience, build an organization, build a culture, deal with the stress of it all. So like my advice on that is, try to find people that kind of understand what it is really like to go through that, because that's the kind of support you need in the very early stage.
Mari and Riku, what would you guys look in an early stage investor?
I have to agree with Mickey. Like, even if I think in the later years, like early investors such as yourself, like what's the most important thing that we got from that relationship? It was trust initially to be able to do the things that we wanted to do, and then it was a lot of emotional support later. And that's actually a surprisingly undervalued part of that relationship is the just sort of the emotional support for when things are difficult. Like it's difficult to explain how shitty things can feel and how much sort of help can be derived from the fact that somebody trusted you as an investor is also there for you in that situation. So I think that's a big part of it that people underappreciate.
Yeah, it's a rough journey to go through.
Very.
It's a rough journey to go through. Like we have gone through this 7 years and ended up now in this like big transaction and everything. But there were multiple times when we were running out of money. We didn't have a long runway left. It was difficult to find investors. We needed to cut down on costs and so forth.
Laying off people that are your friends.
Yeah, so it's not like none of these journeys are like these straight arrow journeys where you just like go from success to success. The reality is that there's a lot of hurdles you need to go through, and you need support in dealing with those hurdles because it's very lonely and very heavy to go through those battles.
And you're doing it for the first time.
Yeah.
In most of the cases. And that's exactly the point where the early stage investors can help. It's not that difficult typically, but the first time is always difficult. So once you know how to deal with it, it's so much easier.
This is the reason why people probably don't found like a second successful company, because you're going to realize that
the first one you know what it is and then you don't want to do it again.
You don't want to do it again.
Fantastic. Where does European tech go from here? Is it mission accomplished?
I mean, certainly not. I think if you think about this type of stuff, it's always like compounding effects. So if we think about where the world was in 2013, and that was kind of the early predictor of what it was going to be a couple years later, then at that time we thought it would maybe go here, and it sort of far exceeded that. I think that's what we'll see. It's really difficult for the human mind to grasp like how big things can actually become. You just sort of try to linearly extrapolate things that already exist. And I think if we look at European tech, it's just going to keep going on the same sort of exponential trajectory. And it's tough to concretely visualize what that would mean in 2 or 3 years. But I think we'll sit here in 2 or 3 years wondering how the heck that happened again. I think that's what'll happen.
So we are gonna end this session with a lightning round. So I want each of you guys to give me, in just one sentence, well, only one sentence, Miki, a prediction about European tech, and a surprising prediction. Who wants to go first?
I can go first. We already talked a little bit about the sort of funding landscape, early stage venture capital, but the one thing we didn't touch upon was sort of the overall venture capital situation. In a sentence, what I would say, the prediction that I personally make for the next 5 years is that the funding gap between US and Europe will become much smaller, much smaller than what people think, perhaps based on today.
Yeah, this is not a surprising prediction. At least to me, it's evident. I think we're going to have at least 5 to 10 companies valued at over 100 billion euros coming out of Europe in the next 5 years.
And continuing from the discussion we've had on enabling cities and local shops, I definitely think we'll see a renaissance of brick and mortar shops flourishing in downtowns thanks to technology.
Fantastic. Marianne, Riku, Miki, thank you very much for sharing these thoughts. Very inspiring, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ilkka, Miki, Marianne, and Riku for joining us. You are a perfect encapsulation of the European talent flywheel at work. In this year's State of European Tech report, diversity and inclusion was front of mind. With the help of Extend Ventures, we were able to cover diversity beyond gender for the first time at a European level. The huge funding divide that exists between white founders and those from ethnic minority backgrounds is something Cyril Lutteroth experienced firsthand after moving back to the UK from the US, where he had launched a number of startups.
And what I noticed was that the landscape and the funding opportunities are much more abundant in the US and the UK. And as a black founder, fundamentally, I kind of struggled and found it hard to tap into these networks which are able to provide me capital.
Cyril's experience was the inspiration for Black Seed, an organization he co-founded to provide funding for black founders. It's based in Brixton, South London, where Black Seed's other co-founder, Karl Lokko, sat down with our very own partner, Hiro Tamura.
Seed, time, harvest. Green trees, black seeds, Afro-Caribbean leads. History colorful, people colorful, lens colorful, trends colorful, spectrum black.
Hi, I'm Atomico Partner Hiro Tamura. I'm in Brixton, South London today with co-founder and chairman of Black Seed, Karl Lokko. Karl, thanks for having us today. It's great to be with you.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you for coming through.
You took an unconventional path to get into tech investing, to say the least. What was your journey growing up in Brixton to get to, a place of, I want to make a difference in my community, and then even expansively beyond that?
I mean, pain. Yeah. Pain. I came from one of the most underserved communities in London, and as a result, actually, it was statistically the worst estate in London. Went to the wrong school. And when we say wrong, not that there is a right, but the statistic speaks of there being a right.
I see.
We know that 70% of venture capital in the UK goes to 1% of the population, which is Oxbridge graduates. Mm-hmm. I am not an Oxbridge graduate. However, I've always had the theme around potential, and that being there, I was diagnosed as a child genius when I was in primary school, did my year 9 SATs in year 6. Big song and dance that I can be and do whatever I wanted to be and do. But my community, my environment was telling me was giving me another message, So I ended up subscribing actually to a detrimental lifestyle, of which was mainly around those that had financial freedom in my area could drive German cars, wear Italian clothes and go to tropical destinations. They actually were doing it illegitimately. It was through the means of criminality and the rest of it. I actually witnessed someone being shot for the first time when I was 12 years old. Yeah. The shooter, after discharging the firearm, actually came back to where me and my friends were playing goal to goal and basically seeked cover, not using us as shields, but literally just took off his jumper, put it on one of our makeshift goalposts and asked me to pass him the ball. Yeah. And you tend to listen to the person you've just seen pull that off. So, that was my introduction to kind of gangland London. We all knew that there was a glass ceiling, beyond actually it being glass, because glass even gives you it has the connotations that maybe you might be able to see past it. I would say a brick, just a roof, yes. We were aware that basically this is our remit, everyone in our community This is basically, you're born here, you have this accent, you went to this school, your parents are in this socio-economic bracket, so this is your, potential essentially. And ultimately, it seemed like the only way to get ahead was illegitimately, so I did subscribe. I was very fortunate to, my reformation actually came in the form of a woman called Pastor Mimi. She ran a church-led initiative in the community, and her son was my right-hand man in the gang that we were in. So she ultimately wanted to save his life, felt that maybe if she could reach one of his mates, it might cross-pollinate, and I was that mate. So she actually turned her house into like an informal therapeutic community gang rehabilitation center. She didn't know she was doing that. All she did was give a damn. All she did was work with what she had, and gave it her all. And ultimately, like, I was a fruit of that. I denounced all my involvement in what I was prior, kind of like leading, essentially, and I was left with a clean slate. And that inspired me to also want to create a solution that I could present to the public, of which was scalable and could actually help us as a nation, because I realized it wasn't just a London situation. This was happening in Glasgow, this was happening in Birmingham, this was happening in Dublin, So basically went about trying to move the dial in that way. That put me into the place of advocating for a fairer business ecosystem, because I understood that gangsterism itself was a byproduct of exclusion.
Tell us, what is Black Seed? What is it doing? What is the impact that you see it having?
Black Seed is a response. I actually started Black Seed the day after George Floyd's online execution. I was having a conversation with my now co-founder around him raising. He had taken part in 10 of the country's top accelerator programs, pitched to over 100 VCs. He had the NHS on the line as a client, had the right patents. It was his third startup, was able to raise successfully in the US twice, but in the UK, it just wasn't happening. So he reached out to me, and we always have this joke, not because I'm any lighter than he is, but because my black book's a lot darker than us all, So essentially, through the graces of nepotism, he felt I'll be able to help him raise, and he was correct. In a week, we're able to help him raise his seed. And it shouldn't be the case. He deserved it. However, he was unable to tap into that without my network. So then when we've now seen what's happening with George Floyd, we're like, do we move the dial for us on a micro or for us on a macro? And we picked the latter. So literally from that day and from that period, that's when I'm being a tech investor.
What is it that you're doing? Tell us about the impact that you're making.
It's one of the most robust offerings we've seen out there in terms of any seed program. We actually give capital for equity. We give a 6-month wraparound component. We also give 6 months rent-free in our offices in Brixton.
Okay.
And the reason why it's so robust is because black founders have been typically over-mentored and underfunded. It's more likely that a black founder will contract skin cancer than to get venture capital funding in the UK. It is that dire.
Yes.
So we get to the bone of it by actually deploying capital, And it seems simple, like a simple thing, but it's not been happening. 88% of black businesses in the country are actually self-funded, So there's the seed fund program angle, and then there's also the community. The community runs in tandem. So what we do is online and offline events. We run them monthly in the Brixton area.
Okay.
Because our whole framing and our long-term vision for the area is to make it the home of black tech. So what we do is that we do online events, offline events, of which we have like fireside chats. We get existing tech entrepreneurs. We get office hours. We have workshops. We recently did a startup weekend with, in association with Google for Startups,
okay.
And where we were able to award one of the founders £10,000 towards their business. So essentially, seed fund program, community, running in tandem, and just offering the black community what they have been denied, essentially.
It's really exciting that you're doing that. I think it's incredibly cool, and we'd also love to be as supportive as we can. Tell us about some of the businesses that you're working with. What kind of founders are there? There's a lot of talent that you're uncovering.
We're finding so many resilient founders, that have been taken on with almost nothing, no real kind of allies, because the black tech ecosystem is one that has been so underdeveloped. And underserved, essentially. We have everything from like deep tech companies. There's one young lady that actually has a bit of tech that she has created that within your false nails or within your luxury watches, you're able to do actually like Apple payments, you know, so which is a really nice touch. We have those like SaaS businesses. We have one that's actually who was awarded the 10K. He has a company called GigBridge, and basically they're just offering solutions. It's almost like a TaskRabbit but 3.0. There's one where it's a celebrity, and they had a child and they were looking for, with an app called Think Dirty, to find basically where it's a natural product that they could put on their daughter. And they couldn't find one that had a 0 rating, so they created one. And essentially what we've done is digitize the process with them. So they're able to create like a subscription, and also it has a QR code that's able to tell kind of diaspora stories, you know, for black families essentially, and black mothers and fathers to share with their children, you know. So I mean, there's a array of different kind of founders and businesses.
Very cool. Tell me a little bit about your investors, how they are working with you. You know, what are the types of, say, limited partners that, you know, that you're in touch with, maybe the funding behind the scenes for Black Seed?
We have some LPs that have been quite like candid. You know, we appreciate that. You know, we feel as if the period for pleasantries is kind of over with. You know, we need to really kind of move the dial in a real way. And some have said that they've never actually had a black founder knock on their doors for maybe, let's say, a Series C round. It's just never happened, you know? So they're like, ultimately, we can tell that that's a pipeline issue, you know? So we totally get that even the institutions that are turning their focus to move the dial for, let's say, black entrepreneurs and black founders, a lot of their remit actually says, and their investment criteria is that they don't invest in seed, you know, so, but this is where the stimulus is. You know, that's where we've seen a big dislocation in terms of maybe the friends and family remit, where those that are coming from particular communities can't raise a seed from friends and family. You know, they couldn't raise a seed from friends and family and their neighbors' friends and family and their neighbors combined, you know? So they're just not being granted any kind of opportunity or access. So we're having pretty straightforward conversations in that way. And a lot of them are actually in for the long-term vision. They see and understand that it's stimulating even this geographical setting to be the home of black tech. And they understand it's an ambitious goal, you know, because ultimately we say, oh, we're gonna make Brixton the Black Silicon Valley, and the US doesn't even have a Black Silicon Valley. And they love the audacity. They also understand that in my day job, I take lead on a 20-story building that's coming, of which we'll literally be able to, and we have actually posed it to house the first black entrepreneurial ecosystem. So they know it's not just wishful thinking, but we have actually some things in play that we're going to be able to move on in a real way. And they know ultimately underrepresented must mean underestimated.
I know for a fact that your ambition levels are incredibly high. Tell us a little bit about what long-term success looks like for you.
Yeah, wow.
And Black Seed.
Long-term success is we live in a society where the parameters of one's ambitions is purely down to their imagination and their commitment to fulfilling that. And they have the ability to be able to pursue their ambitions, but create those solutions, you know, those generational companies, you know, being able to give the best offering they can to humanity without going through all of those barriers, doing those particular dances, you know. So yeah, that would be my grand, like, long-term vision. But I mean, if we're talking over the next decade, over the next decade, for me, it would be that number of 88% of black businesses are self-funded. I want that to drop to about 40. You know, that would be, like, for me, Black Seed, decade, yeah.
Very cool. But I think maybe the first ambition is something that, you know, maybe you push yourself to try to make happen in 10 years. And the second one you make happen in 5.
Wow. Come on, man. Vision, colorful. Mission, colorful. Intention, black. In droves.
That's so cool that you can do that in your neighborhood where you grew up. And
Yeah.
It's a big deal, man.
No, it means a lot. It means a lot. This is more than business.
So Karl, I think you do serve as an example, and for people to be able to believe, that's very meaningful. I understand this is the future, but it's probably beyond Sports Direct and USC. Tell us what is going to happen here.
Yeah, so at the moment it looks like a Sports Direct to the USC, but I promise you, we have plans to build a 20-story building here. I mean, this is actually going to be the home of the country's first black entrepreneurial ecosystem. I mean, exclusively working in tandem to be able to not just give inclusion, but actually actively pump and generate black businesses and really incubate black enterprise and founders, you know? So we envision venture studios in there, Black Seed itself, and all our portfolio companies will occupy a space here also. I mean, the building is socially configured in a way where 20,000 square foot will be given to a civic center space right in the center of the building, of which it will be run independently by the community. You know, also 40% goes towards affordable workspaces, you know, so we're definitely socially minded, but it is capitalism 2.0 embodied, you know, and the provisional working title at the moment is One Brixton.
I can see already the future of the good work that you'll do out of this and the impact that you'll make, but also it's refreshing how you bring an element of reality to your efforts, and lots of respect, and we want to be part of that journey too, Karl. It's been awesome spending time with you.
Legend. Thank you.
Thank you, Karl, for sharing with us your inspirational story. And now, from one inspiring leader to another, next up we have a message from Erin Platz at Silicon Valley Bank.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Atomico State of European Tech 2021 report. I'm Erin Platz, head of EMEA and president of the UK branch of Silicon Valley Bank. We are really delighted to again sponsor and partner with Atomico on its annual report, providing the most in-depth look at what's shaping our European innovation economy and driving its record levels of growth. The State of European Tech report is without doubt the most comprehensive review of the European tech ecosystem, and 2021 has proven itself to be a defining year and really a catalyst for the next decade ahead. At Silicon Valley Bank, we help fuel innovation for a better world by working exclusively with innovators and investors to increase their probability of success. So with clients like Atomico, we support the ecosystem to help finance the growth of innovation businesses and funds from seed to IPO and beyond. We strongly believe the European innovation ecosystem is at a pivotal point of its maturity as we herald the beginning of a golden era. The data and insight from this year's report clearly show this to be true. So today's lineup of experts will expand on what's driving the step change of Europe arriving as a global superpower when it comes to all things innovation and venture. We will also cover the opportunities to accelerate the momentum we've all enjoyed this year and the headwinds that could potentially hold us back. So we really hope that you enjoy the discussions, and on behalf of Silicon Valley Bank, we'd like to thank you for taking the time to tune in. We really can't wait to see what this group does next and look forward to supporting you on your journey ahead.
Thanks for that message, Erin. And I'm now so excited to share the story of Corinne Vigreux, the co-founder and CMO of TomTom. She's a true tech pioneer, and she's being interviewed by Janneke Niessen, who's the co-founder of Capital T and an inspirational figure in her own right. Both have worked for much of their lives in the Netherlands, which, as we saw in this year's report, has had a standout year. So let's now go to the Codam Coding College in Amsterdam.
Hi everybody, welcome to Amsterdam. My name is Janneke Niessen. I'm partner at seed fund Capital T, and I'm really excited to be here today with Corinne Vigreux. Corinne is co-founder of TomTom, vice chair of Just Eat Takeaway, chair of TechLeap, founder of Codam Coding College, basically a pioneer in so many things. She was the first female founder that built a unicorn in Europe, and it took us another 10 years to get number 2. She's one of the OGs of the European tech ecosystem, and she's an amazing example of giving back. So I'm really proud that she's here with us today. Corinne, welcome. Great to have you.
Thanks. You make me blush. Thank God they did a lot of makeup.
Well,
what an introduction.
You are awesome. You are awesome.
Thank you.
So one of the headlines in this year's report is that 100 billion was invested in the European tech ecosystem. For somebody that has been around for so long, what are your thoughts?
Brilliant news. I think it's great. I think it also shows that the potential of the European tech ecosystem. I think when so much money migrates to this ecosystem, it means that people are seeing the vibe and the vibrancy of those new founders coming to the tech community in Europe. So I think it's good news. If you look at what's happened in the US, you've had a couple of very successful tech companies that created quite a lot of wealth and that was reinvested into the ecosystem. And the flywheel in the US has been now turning faster and faster for the last 10 to 15 years. And what are we seeing now in Europe is that flywheel is starting to turn. I think it's excellent news, and I think it's just testimony to the quality of some of the companies that are emerging from this ecosystem.
So this year's report shows a really vibrant ecosystem. The Netherlands stood out in this year's report. So what do you think are the reasons that we as a country have performed so well?
Well, there are some extraordinary big successes in Holland, of course. If you look at ASML, who's the biggest tech companies in Europe today with a market cap in excess of 300 billion. If you look at the newcomers like Adyen, who's at 70 billion. You look at Takeaway, you look at also smaller companies that managed to attract quite a lot of funding like Molly, but also Atrium in the smaller companies, and you look at Picnic. You see that Holland is actually building on the top of very strong companies. And I think that's the flywheel I was talking about earlier. You see a lot of people in the ecosystem starting giving back and basically talent coming out of this ecosystem, working and feeding the flywheel back. So I think this is a very interesting development. And I think, to be honest, I'm not completely surprised. We look also at Booking. Booking is not listed here, but the head office is here. That's a company that originated in Holland. So you can see so many big impact success story in this ecosystem. So it's I'm super. Certainly, as chair of TechLeap, it's fantastic to see so many companies, so many founders doing so well, and so much money coming into the ecosystem, so much value being created here.
And do you think the European market is too fragmented, or do you also, aside from that every country has a strong ecosystem, do you also see a strong European ecosystem?
Yeah, I think more and more we'll need to work with each other. I think that we're not where it should be. But again, I think we should look at Europe as a whole. For me, it's really important to have strong tech companies in Europe. Looking at this report today and the level of investment in that community gives me a lot of optimism with the future. And I think we have a lot of very talented people in this ecosystem. What I find really painful sometimes in seeing founders selling out too early, especially to companies outside Europe. Founders that feel they have to go abroad to be successful or to grow. I think that's also a loss to the ecosystem. So it's very interesting to see companies like Adyen, like Takeaway, like Booking, like TomTom, having grown in this ecosystem to a very large size and hard market capitalization. So I think that's encouraging.
Yeah. And
so Spotify.
So as somebody who has been around for quite some time, you have seen a lot happening over the last 20 years, but when you look ahead for the next 20 years, what is it that really excites you and what do you hope that will happen?
So I'm super psyched. When I look at what's happening and how much money is pouring in here, it's the beginning of Europe and the recognition of Europe as a serious ecosystem. I'm looking next 20 years with a very strong Europe, building the next tech giant in the world to compete with what's happening in the US and in Asia. So I think that's a good sign. There's one thing that worries me is the tech education. I think that I'd like government to realize that tech is actually here to stay. Tech has a big impact on our lives, whether it's health tech, whether it's climate change, whether it is the new type of mobility. There is a lot to be done, and tech will have a massive impact on our lives. And I think it's important that the government recognize that and introduce digital education early on in the curriculum, just for young people able also to understand the world around them, to be able to understand the news that they consume. Where is it coming from? That actually a lot of algorithms are deciding what's happening. And if they get a feel for that, it's also going to make them more active citizens, if you want, in this next generation. So I think it is one thing that I find a little bit disappointing in Europe is we're not catching up fast enough and not changing education fast enough. One of the reasons I've set up CODAM, again, on a great initiative of Xavier Niel in France, and based on École 42, now 33 schools around the world following that same system. So I am very optimistic that Europe can make it. I think what we're seeing today is a sign in the right direction, but I'd like to see more digital education throughout, and more collaboration between the different ecosystems as well, with London, Berlin, Stockholm, Paris, of course, and Amsterdam. And I think we have a chance, if we pull our resources together, our knowledge together, to really be serious contenders for building the next tech giants.
Yeah, and I think I can remember when I first started, being an entrepreneur was not a sexy thing, not an obvious career choice. Everybody basically told me, don't do it. Yeah. I guess you experienced the same, and see also that changed in the ecosystem, more talent?
Yeah, more talent, more... it's more taking risk is probably more persuasive. That at the time it was also people were looking at you funny. I remember I'd never said I was a founder of a tech company. It's only recently that I said, well, it looks like it's quite cool to be a founder of a tech company. It wasn't in the last 20 years. So I think that's one thing. But more importantly, what's interesting is sort of startup founders are innovators. And I feel that we kind of make the world turn around. And I think that's important to see that this is changing. And we see a lot of young people and talented people wanting actually to take risk and make things happen. I mean, if you look at TomTom, there is a world before TomTom and after TomTom. The amount of marriages we've saved, and we brought digital navigation to the world. And that feels good. And other companies could have done it, but they didn't. So I think you see this with a lot of tech companies today that are really making a big difference. And so you want to get that ecosystem to flourish, and want to do that in Europe.
You also are very passionate about diversity and inclusion. Why is that?
Well, I think that, first of all, I think if you are an innovator and you want to change the world, or you want to do something different, you need to also have people who think in the different ways. So what I like about diversity at every level is when you look at solving a problem, it's much easier to do it when you have different points of views. Because people who think the same, who look the same, it's unlikely to have a very interesting ways of solving issues. The other thing is, of course, we've got a big war for talent. It is probably one of the biggest problems today about the tech community worldwide. So I think that we don't want to be fishing in half a pond, and therefore we need to really embrace diversity. And I think we need to make it a very comfortable place for men, women, but also people of every culture. And I think that's very. I think we're going to have to anyway, and hopefully make sure that women feel comfortable in that tech world.
Yes, and what I'm sometimes wondering, I'm curious what you think, because we publish diversity stats for years, we've been talking about it for years, but still change is really slow. Do people not care? Is it really unconscious bias, or are they just lazy? What do you think?
No, I think it is difficult. But it is possible. I mean, look, we at CODAM is this coding school that I founded, and we have, it's coding, software engineering school. We have 36% of women. So if we go and target women specifically and explain and make it a nice environment, actually software engineering is about creativity, so we attract women. There's also more women founders. We can see that they're coming, but it's too slow. And I think we just need to maybe what we're doing today show that women like you and I who founded tech companies, we're kind of Okay, we've raised kids, mine a bit older than yours, but they've done fine, and we've always worked. So I think it's also a way of showing that it's possible, but also making an environment where women feel they can thrive as well, and just get a little bit away from that bro culture. But again, that fight for talent is playing in women's favor, because companies will have to ensure that they have a more diverse group. At TomTom, we're quite good at it. We're really trying to encourage more women to come through. I believe in mentorship as well, and sponsorship within organization, looking and onboarding younger women. So I think that's one way of bringing them to the top. There's no silver bullet,
no.
But creating a good environment, I think, will help.
Yeah, one of the things that's also clear from the report, that investment for female founders, underrepresented founders, is still behind and slow. What do you see can change that and actually get more great entrepreneurs that happen to be women or underrepresented founders also funded?
People like you. Yeah, I mean, that's the reason why I became an LP in Capital T. I think the work that you and Eva are doing, and not only because you're women, but your approach to investment is super interesting. You're looking at statistics. You're looking at you're looking at it from a very scientific way, in a way, and just using also your experience into investing into successful companies. So I think that's. Yeah, VCs like yourself that are really making it a point and taking the time to look at mixed teams and female founder. That's going to make the difference. We need more Capital T.
Well, I can, of course, only applaud that. Well, and I guess all the companies also attract a lot of talent, which is helpful, because talent is one of the things we are all looking for. The infrastructure is great. Do you also see any challenges in the Dutch ecosystem?
Talent is probably the biggest issue that tech has in general. And some of the worry I have is some large tech companies are coming and sucking that talent out. So it's interesting to see that we are training more and more people. So people worked for... When I started TomTom, it was quite difficult to recruit. And also we didn't have many employees that came from a tech ecosystem, because it just wasn't there. When I see now our employees ending up in either started companies themselves, like Flinders, for example, in Holland, or a very successful e-commerce company, you see that with the people we've trained with this risk-taking, this mentality, for this innovation drive, that's really helping the ecosystem as a whole. And you see a lot of TomTom employees everywhere in the ecosystem, and people from Booking. There is a virtuous circle, if you want, and I think that's very encouraging.
Being a founder is tough. I think we both recognize that it's not easy. And well, it can be a big thing. And now that the ecosystem is growing further, there's more money flowing around it, there's more pressure on the founders. Do you feel there's enough attention to mental health of founders in Europe? Or is that still a subject we prefer not to talk about and just go on?
Well, the problem is being a founder and running a tech company is not easy. I mean, in general, it goes really fast. You need to be, I mean, if you look at TomTom, I mean, we have been disrupted so many times. And if you look at how we've pivoted the whole business from inventing SatNav, as I said earlier, to now being leading in mapping, with one of 3 map makers in the world, in traffic information, we're basically sort of looking at mapping the world in real time. So it's all about sort of sensor-derived observations, so things we get from cameras and new inputs into our maps and automation at a high level. The amount of you need to keep going and never lose sight of your big picture and sort of your Northern Star. It's not easy, but at the same time, yeah, do we have really time to? I don't know. You know, I've never stopped working. I started the business. I ran the business for the first 12 years on my own. Then Harold and the guys came on. Then I was chief commercial, and then I run the consumer P&L. I run this consumer P&L at a time where, you know, I had to let it glide, where things were starting to decrease. And so running a business in a declining market, that's the reason why I started the sports watches. You always look at how can I keep innovating, keep serving my customers, keep growing my business. We have 5,000 employees, 35 countries, the responsibility towards your employees. You don't have much time to think about,
No, that's true. But what I think, and that's why I'm so excited also about the ecosystem getting stronger, is that I think it can feel very lonely, like you're the only one facing all these challenges. So having other entrepreneurs to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Think you also have a group of founders, and I always try to tell the founders we invest in, make sure you have a group of people you trust. Feel free to always reach out to us. Trying to, because I can see in it that the pressure on founders is...
Yeah, you need a high level of resilience to be a tech founder. I think that's true, and it's not...
but did it help you to have other founders around you to talk?
I'm going to be very honest. I met them later on in life. I think as we were building the business, it's your head is down, and you trying to, you're working hard, and you're trying to make things, at some point you get the impression you're driving that Ferrari very close to the cliff. So you kind of say hold hands on deck and with your board and your... I think it's important for founders, especially the one who look for investors from the outside, that people understand your business. That's more the point. Because when you're trying to manage a business in difficult circumstances and you've got people who've invested and try to give you all sorts of advice, but don't necessarily understand what it is that you try to do, that makes things a lot more complex and difficult. In a way, the fact that we bootstrap to IPO and that we still have 48% of the shares helps, because you can really look long term. And I think that's probably more helpful to founders, to find people in their ecosystem or to found them that actually understand what motivates them, that passion. Because when things go up and down, you want to be working with people who's going to help you find a solution instead of saying, well, we've put that much money and now it's time to return. I think that is important to look at the longer term. And yes, talking to other founders can help. But I don't think that's at the end of the day, you need to look at yourself and that resilience. I think it's been nice to have a group of people, and but it's not like I would be lying if I said that was a big. It's nice, and we meet once a year, and it's and when you have a bad day, I have a bad day, I come here at Codam. At some time when it's like every company, you think, oh my God. I come here and I see the students and how they're doing, and the fact that as a founder I've been able to give back as well. I mean, that's also something that gives me a lot of satisfaction and help me cope with the tough days.
Yeah. No, I can imagine if you walk around here, you basically see the future. So that's a nice bridge to my next question. What excites you about the next 20 years? What do you hope to see? What are you excited about when you think about the future?
Well, I genuinely would like to see a strong European tech industry, and I know you would say that because we're having this interview, but that's generally, for me, a big driver. I think that there is so much knowledge and so much talent in Europe that we've got to be master of our own destiny, especially in technology. And I'd like people to understand that technology is everywhere, and it's everywhere for good. It's going to help a lot of problems. It's going to have a massive impact in health, a massive impact in education, have a massive impact in mobility, and all sorts of areas where tech is having a big role. And we've got to be at the table and not on the menu in Europe. You really have to develop a strong European community. So tech community. So I want to see that for the next 20 years. What I'd like to see is more better tech education. I think governments underestimate the digital literacy, and I would bring digital literacy much earlier on in the curriculum. There's a lot of differences depending on different European countries, but I would really see that as a priority, and in trying not only to work in tech industry, but but also to understand the world around you. You want to understand how information is given to you. You want to understand what happens behind those algorithms, that they're written by the people. So to understand a bit more of the keys and decode what's happening around you. So I'd like to see that. And I'm a big believer in technology. I think technology is there for good, it's there to stay, and will have a very positive impact. I just want Europe to have a strong Europe to help solve some of the climate issues that we have, energy issues that we have, health issues that we have.
No, I think we can definitely agree there. As an ecosystem, we need to act like entrepreneurs. As soon as you think you've arrived, basically that's the end. So we need to stay sharp and continue to strive for better things. One last question to end with today. You mentioned something about turtles being important for the tech ecosystem. Can you explain what they are and why they are so important?
We love turtles.
Yes.
And turtles are basically Europeans that have moved over to the US or to Asia, coming back to Europe. So people who've experienced the life and the entrepreneurialism of Silicon Valley, for example, in product management, which is something that's not very well developed in Europe, have been a bit in that Silicon Valley pressure cooker and just want to come back to their roots maybe, or to a Europe that's, and we've said, where a lot more money is flowing in, a lot more opportunities, and where they can contribute. At TomTom, we're just recruiting more and more turtles, and you can see that they're coming with a different point of view, the thing in the US is everything is possible, and something you want to bring into Europe is that it's that risk-taking, it's the level of ambition. And with mixing the talent that we have here with entrepreneurs that have seen a different way of working abroad, I think that's a recipe for good magic to make to make Europe bigger in terms of tech.
Well, thanks a lot. I think we can conclude that we are really excited about the future of Europe. We still have a lot of ambitions, and we would love to see more turtles as well. Thank you.
A huge thank you to Corinne and Janneke for your insights. We wouldn't have as much to celebrate in the State of European Tech report if it wasn't for everything you've done to champion the ecosystem. Next up, we have a short message from Stephen Pace at Baillie Gifford. Welcome to the SOET family.
Hi, I'm Stephen Pace, Head of European Equities at Baillie Gifford. Through the last 100 years or so of being an independent partnership, as well as making many mistakes, we've come to believe that to generate extreme positive returns, we need to find and invest in the world's most exceptional growth companies and to support them for long periods of time, even as they transition from private to public markets. We've had the pleasure of co-investing with Atomico before, but this year we are also delighted to sponsor their State of European Tech report. This report, as previous editions have also done, shines a welcome light on the tremendous progress of Europe's tech ecosystem. Whether it's the number of companies reaching unicorn status or the increasingly supportive funding environment, we think that you'll agree that Europe's future has never looked as promising. This is our time to accelerate the revolution we are seeing in some industries and to help build a sustainable future. We hope you take as much inspiration from the report's findings as we do. There is still a lot of work to be done, but the combination of unprecedented levels of ambition and patient capital is a truly potent mix. Thank you. And now, on with the show.
Thank you so much, Stephen. One of the biggest stories this past year has been the continued rise of Fintech, which has attracted the most investment and created more value than any other sector. And the company leading the way is based in Sweden, which is where we're headed next. And these two speakers need little in the way of introduction. Sebastian Siemiatkowski is the co-founder and CEO of Klarna, Europe's most valuable private tech company. And Niklas Zennström is one of the true pioneers of European tech, having co-founded Skype as well as Atomico. They sat down in Stockholm to talk about how Klarna became a global category leader and why its ambitions for the future are even greater.
Sebastian, thank you so much for having me, and it's great to be here in Klarna headquarters in Stockholm to share a little bit about the journey of scaling one of Europe's most successful tech company.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
The success you've had with Klarna is extraordinary, but I know also it wasn't always smooth sailing. And can you share a little bit with us how you went about to scale from first Sweden and then now becoming a global company?
When we started it very early, 2005, with 3 founders, we did a lot of sales. We're out there meeting clients, and we started this kind of snowball that started really rolling. And then as we were growing as a company, starting to reach like 1,000 people, it really changed. It put a very different type of requirements on ourselves as founders, as managers, and really kind of challenged us on like, how do you make a big company work? Like, I understand how to make a small company work, but a big company. And so in 2010 and 11, when we started going into new markets and so forth, was a time when I started getting nervous about the momentum in the business. I started feeling that we weren't taking decisions as fast, we were growing political, we were hiring a lot of senior executives that were supposed to come in and fix everything. And you could feel that momentum was slowing down. So it was a quite challenging time, but obviously we were very focused on still kind of learning, experimenting, and trying to find a way forward. And it took us I would say about 3 years until 15, really, when my second co-founder left, that we started kind of finding a new way of working internally, and then that kind of laid the foundation for the continuous growth.
The big thing for me the last 18 months or so, or 2 years maybe, has been the success of the US, which now is the largest market for Klarna. Was there a moment or pivotal point where you realized how you could make that really big?
We launched in the US in 15, and at that point of time, it was more just to put like a flag there and say like, we're going to do something, but we didn't really had yet like a clear idea of what the opportunity would look like and how we should create the perfect product market fit and so forth. My biggest challenge was that I felt that I could go and speak to a merchant and come back with an idea or do something, but then I was going back to an organization in Sweden that, in order to deliver a new feature or new service could take up to a year. And I realized that with that pace, we would just never break through in that market. So in 15 to 18, I really spent my main focus on kind of really, that was the time when we really started finding a way of working. We had rehauled a lot of the technology. We got the right managers in place, and so we were well equipped. And then in 2018, I remember going to the US with the management team, and we kind of said like, this is it. Like, it's either now we're going to make it work or not. And so then we just, we just dropped everything, and it was just 100% focused on the US after that. And that has really, given results now. But it was fairly, I would say, I felt fairly dark in the beginning because we had some strong competition. They were, slightly ahead of us, and so it was. It required a lot of discipline and a lot of like hard work to overcome that.
And given the size of the US market, and typically, if you win the US market, then it's easier to become the global company.
Right.
In hindsight now, would it have been better to just, when you started the company from the beginning, or at some point you just kind of pick up everything and just move the whole company to the US? Or do you think that scaling a company from Stockholm and Europe is actually pretty okay?
I think that is something that has changed massively, right? So when we started Klarna in 2005, like really the only person we could look to that had done something on a global scale was you, right? I mean, you were a massive inspiration for us with what you had done with Skype, and because it was the only European example of a company that had started here and that had that global success. And I think also when I look at my first years, like 2005 to maybe 12, at that point of time, the advice that we were getting on how to grow and scale the company was of very poor quality. So we were poorly advised by so many people that were involved with the company at that point of time, board members that claimed to have experience, people and so forth. They had simply never scaled at this rate, because it hadn't happened at that time. There were very few companies that had done that, so they had a very poor understanding of what that meant and what the challenges and how you needed to go about. And I think at that point of time, in San Francisco, if you were 2005 to 12, you already had Google, you had a couple of really successful companies, and so there was more maturity, more understanding of what the requirements were, what kind of people you need, how you need to operate, and so forth to be able to scale at that rate. And I think we were struggling with that. Now it's changed massively, right? Because now there is in Europe a number of companies that done really well and has scaled, so that experience exists. And at the same point of time, what's happened in San Francisco is that it's totally overhyped, right? So engineers there work for maximum 1 year at a company and then they move on to another. Actually, most companies that I speak to today that are entrepreneurs and that are in Silicon Valley, the entrepreneur sits in Silicon Valley and then all the engineers are in Ukraine, right? Yeah. So like, really, it's just the entrepreneur that sits there. But like, so I think that today we feel that being in Europe has a massive advantage. We have access to, fantastic engineering talent across the continent, and it's kind of a healthier environment to operate in. Which actually allows us to be, successful in many markets.
Well, thank you for that. And it's true that Silicon Valley had so many role models, and now you're one of the role models here. Let's move a little bit to the buy now, pay later model, which is everyone is so excited about. It's the fastest growing payment method, because this was actually based a little bit on some Swedish spending patterns. So tell us a little bit about when you started, what was the kind of the problem that you tried to solve?
The kind of 2004 and 5 when we started Klarna was a fun time because there was a lot of e-commerce entrepreneurs out there, and they all were starting these small companies, and they realized that they could like buy Google AdWords really cheaply and sell something, right? And some of them developed to amazing companies. So it was a kind of a fun time, but we realized at that point of time that the usage of a debit card online, because Sweden was a debit card market, it basically asks the consumer to send money to the merchant, and then hopefully receive the product that they saw in the picture, which at the point of time, especially then, people were very nervous. Would I receive this? People didn't trust the internet, etc. And so the idea, very basic concept was like, why wouldn't the consumer get the products first, touch and feel them before they pay for them? And that was it. And it turned out that like both consumers preferred that because they felt more safe and it was more easy and so forth. But also merchants as a consequence could see more sales and growing faster. So that was kind of the basic form of it. Now what has accelerated Klarna and why you're seeing this buy now pay later is because in the US and in the UK, there's a shift away from credit cards towards debit cards. So more people have debit cards than ever, which is great because people should have debit cards, not credit cards. Yeah. So that's amazing. But then when they shop online, they struggle with debit cards. And so, our services solve for that.
And today, Klarna is a $46 billion company. Of course, it's a textbook example of disruption. But it also feels to me when I follow you, as a founder and as a company, that the more successful you are, the more ambitious you get. Is that accurate?
Well, I think yes, and I think to some degree, obviously you move the step of what you want to accomplish, and you get more bold about what you're trying to do. But I also think to some degree that it is a very interesting market because we're in this $1 trillion market called retail banking, and it hasn't really cared about this customer, and it doesn't have modern technology, and so like to your point, all of the prerequisites are really there, which is super exciting, and at the same point of time, I kind of recognize it, and I think to me maybe more because I was there at the early days of e-commerce. I remember when we first raised money for Klarna, some investors told us people are never going to shop clothing online because that was the sentiment in 2004. Like that was still the sentiment, right? So like, and I recognize, and then e-commerce came along, and then Zalando started growing, and everyone was screaming at Kinnevik that it was crazy that they had this valuation because it didn't make sense. Like, and then wow, suddenly Zalando was worth a lot of money. Like, so the point is that like, it's coming now. You can see this shift, and people always there's a hype, and then comes a down, and then comes a hype. Yeah. But the shift, but the trend doesn't it doesn't change. Like e-commerce is eating more and more retail, and digital banking will eat more and more of the traditional banks.
And you came into this as a payment service. What I liked about what you guys did early on, that you said we're going to be a bank. Mm-hmm. So you're taking an approach now to transform retail banking coming from an entry point of payments, which I like as an investor because your unit economics are so much better than the other entrants.
Yes. No, I think that's the case, and I think that, in essence, if you look at banking, it really is saving, lending, and payments, right? Those are the three core elements of what it's been about, and I think the payments is a very natural entry point And that's where we're going to be very, very focused.
So one thing we set out to do with Atomico when we started was to build a venture firm that could be there for founders in the long term and hopefully add some value to the founders in their journey and have empathy with them. Is that something that is in your mind as a founder? Is that something that's useful, or is it about raising money at the highest valuation?
Well, first and foremost, it's definitely not about the highest valuation. I did that mistake when we took in money in 2010. We had gone from Sequoia coming in, at $100 million, and then just 1 year later we did $1 billion, and that was just too fast. What I learned from that is that it wasn't great because we came into a situation where we had a too high valuation, and the latest investors were not too happy about it because they realized that it was going to take time to grow, and we started seeing a lot of cracks in the growth of the company. And so I really learned from that it's not about the highest valuation. It's about having, people that you trust, that have integrity, that are going to support you through the ups and downs, and preferably, so you got to find those people, and you got to be willing to take them on, not always at the highest valuation. And that's the advice that I give to other founders today as well. There's a big difference between investors in their integrity, and they're willing to back you, etc. And then secondly to that, providing advice or providing additional, other support services and so forth. That varies a lot because that always comes back to what kind of people do you have in your organization? In Atomico, you've always had this guy, recruitment. Dan, who's amazing. And we've had a lot of help from him. So but it becomes very individual. It's really about your ability to attract the people that can really, give proper and good advice, right? And that's hard to judge as an entrepreneur early on when you talk to a firm, but it matters. So I think it's the trustworthiness and the integrity of the people that you work with.
Silicon Valley can be sometimes, maybe not so much anymore, but it was a time when they were very critical about copycats and European copycats. Right. And it's funny now to see that maybe the tide has turned where you have companies like some of the big Silicon Valley companies like Square, a firm, and even Apple to some extent are following and being inspired by what you guys have done in Klarna. How do you feel about that, and how are you going to stay ahead? Because some of them are pretty big companies.
First of all, obviously it's flattering to some degree, and then it's also frustrating to another. But I think my biggest frustration actually was that when we were not active on the US market, right? That meant that we were coming with ideas. We were trying to come with new ideas, and it's hard. It's hard to innovate, and it's hard to stay front. And when you did that, and then so other companies implementing the same things in the US, but you're not active in that market, wow, that's a massive frustration. Yeah. Nowadays, at least, we can lead ourselves in the US with our offering. So now it's more well, that's just how it's going to play out, right? People are going to copy what you do. I find that Silicon Valley still, however, is very centric on itself. And actually, that's one of its weaknesses, to be honest. Even if Apple now introduces buy now, pay later, as I said in an interview, when is it going to come to Europe? I don't know, 10 years from now, 15 years from now? It's the Europe is as big as a market as the US. So.
And you've been at this now for 16 years, and everyone wants to know what's next for Klarna. So can you share with us your vision for the future?
So I think global presence is very key. That's going to continue. And with global, I mean maybe ex-China, because China is a very different animal. I think the second thing is that buy now, pay later for us is a fantastic feature. It offers a lot of value, but obviously it's just a feature. So at the end of it, it's people come into these checkouts, they have all these buttons, PayPal, Apple Pay, Google Pay, this Pay, whatever. And then they have this Klarna button. And the key question right now that I ask everyone internally is why will anyone click this button instead of the other buttons? What's the value? So what is the value creating for customers? How is it, improving their lives? How are you saving them time, saving them money, making them less worried about their finances? So I think keeping really focused at that. But right now I feel more than ever, it's not about because we did a pivot. We've done 2 pivots, one around 10 and one around 15. But now it's not about that. Now it's just keep our heads down and just keep extremely focused and just kind of continue doing what we're doing, because we're at the right trajectory. But again, we have the massive benefit of this tremendous addressable market, right? It's just limitless, right? It's just so huge.
Congratulations to the success, and we're so privileged to be part of your journey. So
Well,
thank you for that.
Thank you for supporting us.
Thank you for spending the time with us, Sebastian.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian and Niklas. This year has been an exercise in resetting our ambition to think bigger and bolder than ever. And Klarna's story is exactly the inspiration we need. Every year since we launched this report, we've heard the same thing. Policy, regulatory fragmentation, and geopolitics are some of the most pressing concerns in the minds of entrepreneurs. This year, a fifth of founders feel policy is the biggest challenge European tech will face in the next 12 months. But there's uncertainty and confusion about how these issues are being addressed in Brussels and beyond.
So here to discuss how tech is essential to delivering on policy and why understanding policy is so critical to people innovating through tech are two people with truly distinct perspectives. So now let's join Linda Griffin, co-founder of the European Technology Alliance and VP of Global Public Policy at CRE, who's speaking with Executive Chairman of the Institute for Global Change and former UK Prime Minister, Tony Blair.
Thank you, Tom. Tony Blair, welcome to this year's launch of the State of European Tech Report, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Linda.
Great, so let's get straight into it. There can be a sense that policymakers often jump on issues that the tech community feel don't matter as much. So if you look at the resources that are going into the GAIA-X discussions around the European cloud, people can sometimes be worried that's potentially creating further walls rather than helping businesses move data around internationally and giving them legal certainty. So my question is quite pointed. Why should we care whether policymakers have a good understanding of technology and whether tech entrepreneurs themselves have a solid appreciation of policymaking?
It's important for the reason you've just given, Linda, because what the policymakers will do in respect of regulation, creating the environment in which companies exist and work and have to conform, that is something that will have a dramatic impact on the way the technology companies develop. Policymakers are going to be talking about that impact technology companies, that impact their growth, their development, the markets they exist and work in. And, you know, a lot of tech founders that I meet want as little as possible to do with government, with bureaucracy, with regulators, but it's a fact of life. And one of the biggest problems we've got today is the gap between the change makers on the one side and the policy makers on the other. And one of the things my institute works on is trying to put the two together because they matter to each other. Technology matters enormously to the development of the economy and society, and policy makers have the power to do good or ill in respect of technology in the tech industry. So I know there's a huge reluctance, certainly on the part of the technology folk to get involved with policymakers, but they really should.
I think I often say to people, it's a case of if you care about who makes the rules that govern your operating environment, you need to engage, and it should be part of your business planning.
Sure, it must be and should be if you want. Well, if you want to grow to a decent size. Yeah. I mean, often if you're in a very specific niche, or maybe you're just going to carry on being quite a small company, but if you've got ambitions to really grow and go into multiple markets. I mean, I remember about 10 or 12 years ago having a conversation with one of the tech founders, what is now one of the giant technology companies, and saying to them, you really should take seriously the fact that as you grow, if you become a giant, the policymakers will want to regulate you and you'll have such an impact on society. There's going to be massive public interest concerns. And they were very indifferent to it at the time, but they're not now today. They've got vast amounts of compliance officers and government affairs people. Now, you don't need to do that right at the start, but you need at least to be cognizant of what's going on in the policy world that can affect your world.
Absolutely. So I'm interested in the issues that founders and policymakers often agree or disagree on. So you were the UK Prime Minister, you're Institute for Global Change has tech policy at the heart of what it does. Your son is a successful tech entrepreneur, your daughter-in-law a leading tech investor. So your family dinner conversations in a way could be a microcosm of this very debate. When the three of you get together, is there anything in terms of tech public policy that you agree on?
Well, truthfully, Linda, the knowledge of my son and daughter-in-law about technology is so much greater in terms of depth of understanding that it's more like, you know, they're the teachers and I'm the pupil, really. But I think that there's a broad agreement between us that if technology is the thing that is really changing the world today, and my theory of politics is that the technology revolution is the thing that politicians should concentrate upon, not for reasons of regulation, but for reasons to do with what technology can achieve in terms of development. It should revolutionize and will revolutionize everything from healthcare to education, even to law and order and defense. And one of the specific things the Institute concentrates on is how can tech accelerate development. So today in much of the developing world, there's no need for them to build the legacy systems of the West. They can use technology to circumvent those. And then, you know, we have a whole program, for example, around agricultural technology and how that can change the way we produce food and consume food. You know, you've got technology is the answer to climate change. There isn't another answer unless you're going to tell the developing world not to consume. So you've got to show them how to consume sustainably. So really, I think for any people who are broad-minded enough to look at the world, not just their own company, this relationship between public policy and technology is vital. Part of the problem is that it's become, for a lot of policymakers, simply about regulation. Whereas the purpose of what the Institute's trying to do is to say, no, okay, there are all sorts of issues on regulation and we should deal with those, they're important issues. But it's about much more than how you regulate technology. It's also about how you harness that technology for public good.
Absolutely. This actually brings me on to this question, which is quite related. So this year's State of European Tech report surveyed respondents said the greatest threat that they perceive to the tech ecosystem in Europe in the next 12 months. First, of course, access to talent and funding. But regulation came a strong third behind in that. So industry on the one hand appears to be quite worried about future policy changes and perhaps the focus on what they might think is over-regulation, but they often don't understand on how to engage in the process effectively. So how can founders realistically engage in Brussels policy discussions without it just being seen as a time sink, I suppose, taking them away from building their business and actually creating jobs?
Yes, there are always two risks when you engage with policymakers. One is the time sink problem. You know, you spend time doing that rather than running the business. And the second thing is that you look as if you're just arguing for special interests, right, and not the public interest. But there are ways of overcoming that. And, you know, the most important thing to realize about politicians is their general problem is actually ignorance. It's not lack of goodwill. So a lot of politicians, you know, if you go and speak to members of the European Parliament or even members of the UK Parliament, any parliament you can think of in Europe right now, the first thing they'll probably want to talk to you about is Facebook and privacy and all of those things, which are all important. But what's vital to show them is that is only one part of the discussion. The other part of the discussion is, for example, how the use of technology can transform healthcare, can reduce costs, extend provision for people, how revolutionary new treatments can be properly utilized, how you want to reorganize your healthcare system so that it's about prevention and not just about cure. You know, a whole series of things.
It's like equality of access.
Yeah, no, of course. And these things are massive. And, you know, we're looking at things now like, what's the future of food, right? Which may appear to be very long term, but I think will be upon us quite quickly. And then, you know, the important thing is also for people to realize we've now got a climate change ambition, which is massive. I mean, I think people in the UK, for example, they haven't really got their heads around the fact that our climate ambition, which is now a matter of political consensus, is going to mean we have to double electricity provision in the UK over the next 10 to 15 years.
I don't think that's commonly known.
No, people don't know this at all. Now, that is a massive undertaking. So how are you going to do it? How are you going to show people how to to change the demand side of power generation and not just the supply side, which is what people have looked at up to now. So you've got all of these questions in which, for the policymakers, it's vital they understand what technology can do, and this revolution that's going to change everything about the way that we work and live and interact with each other. That is the thing. I mean, it's the and you know, I find when I'm talking to politicians and I say to them, look, you guys should be thinking about technology before you think about anything else. I say, he's obviously been out of power for too long, doesn't quite understand it. And I say to him, no, you're not understanding how the world's changing. In the 19th century, by the way, it took politics decades to catch up with the Industrial Revolution. I mean, for several decades in the 19th century, people were still talking about kind of, you know, landlords and tenants and Whigs and Tories in a very old-fashioned way. And then suddenly, towards the middle of the century, people started to realize, no, the real world thing that's happening is people working in new industrial organizations, people going down the mines, you know, people with all sorts of issues around how industry was going to be changed with massive social and economic impacts. And then politics eventually took them almost until the end of the century to catch up with it. Now, the world moves faster today, but the principle's still the same.
It's interesting, there's a lot of elections coming up in Europe, have just been had, but the discussions are really the same kind of clinchers that were around 20 years ago. There's not really, you know, votes aren't going to be decided on environmental policy. It'll be a nice to have, but I don't think it's really at the center of these political debates at the moment.
No, it's coming that way. And you can see this, for example, by the advance of the Greens in Germany. But no, it's not. And one of the reasons why a lot of the debate in Europe is around, on the left, quite an old-fashioned, you know, more power to the state agenda, and on the right, towards nationalism, you know, anti-immigrant policies. And by the way, that's also important for tech. I mean, if one of the biggest problems is attracting talent, you've got to have an immigration policy that encourages the talent to come. And one of the problems, you know, I've always thought with Brexit is that you know, the moment you end that European freedom of movement, you're going to make it tougher for the UK to attract tech talent. And yet for the UK, the tech sector is one of the 2 or 3 most important sectors for industrial growth.
Absolutely. I'm glad you've brought up Brexit because we love talking about it. So we won't debate Brexit. Brexit is, you know, it's been done in some form. But looking forward, obviously a lot of major European startups are coming out of the UK still. And we don't want more fragmentation across the European market. How do we ensure that there's more cooperation, or at least that we don't lose the sense of cooperation between the UK and the rest of Europe when it comes to tech policies?
Yeah, I mean, look, the problem with Brexit is you can say that the decision to do it is over and legally we've left. Unfortunately, the consequences are still with us and we have to work through them. And, you know, I've always said this, that Britain will miss Europe, but Europe will miss Britain. And this is one of the areas in which Europe will miss Britain, because I think if Britain was round the table when it comes to technology regulation, you'd actually have a better chance of getting it right. So I think we've got to, I mean, if I was back in power today, I would be making cooperation around technology regulation one of the areas that Europe and Britain work on. I mean, there's no reason why we can't, by the way, even outside of the European Union. So, you know, in one sense, the UK could set a standard that is more ambitious around technology. But on the other hand, if you end up with 2 completely different systems and you've already got a different system in the US, it's not going to be good. And you know, the recent paper from my institute was suggesting that really you need to try and build a transatlantic bridge on technology regulation between the US and the European Union, because ultimately we're all going to be competing with China.
Yeah, that actually, this is, I suppose, a timeless question. I think one we've discussed before, but basically we know tech can reach across national and regional barriers, and it's great for us that use those services, but it's notoriously hard to regulate for. So in Europe and beyond, we're seeing a lot more fragmentation. So looking at crypto, new forms of growing food, AI, platform workers' rights, digital health, content, competition, and more data and privacy. This is all fragmenting. Do you think we need a new type of institution to regulate tech?
I think we need a new type of cooperation, sure, and whether that's done or how that's done institutionally, I've got an open mind on. But yes, for sure, because you know, you're right. It's going to be across virtually every area. AI raises huge issues. You if food technology becomes as big as I think it will eventually, then that's got a whole series of issues that arise from that. You've got GDPR from Europe already setting a standard in a way, but it's not always clear that that is a standard that's...
It's quite a fragmented standard.
It is, and so it would make a lot of sense for at least the major democracies to come together, because that's the other thing that's happening with the internet. There are countries that are using control of the internet, shutting down the availability of it, and that's also going to be a big problem, because when you come to regulate, there will be different values. I mean, China will have a different value system. It's creating technology and using it in different ways, underpinned by different values and different interests. So we need to get this right, and that's why it's so important that you've got, if I was back in government again today, I would have a very strong linkage between the people creating the change and the people deciding how you regulate it.
Another interesting fact from this year's report was only about a quarter of founders in Europe felt that the regulatory environment had changed for the better over the last year, while 20% felt it had actually gotten worse. So we talked a little bit about what founders, how founders should be engaging more and why, but what can specifically Brussels policymakers do to improve these perceptions? Now, because they're finalising a lot of huge cross-cutting proposals on AI, on competition, on content. What can they do to engage with the community more?
I think, it is a weakness of the European system that they've got quite an old-fashioned view around regulation. And part of the problem with regulation in a fast-moving world is that it becomes out of date very quickly. And there is a case, we've discussed this from an institute perspective of having a principles-based regulation rather than a sort of rule-based.
A list of things you can do.
Yeah, and also that your regulation is, you build within it the capacity for it to evolve without necessitating every time the world moves that you have to introduce a whole lot of new regulation. And I think this is really important to get right, and it's important that there is a clear understanding, between the policymakers and those who are inventing the changes that affect all of us. And I think some European politicians get it very well.
Yep.
I think Macron gets it absolutely, and there are other, sometimes from the smaller countries. I mean, if you look at how Estonia has, changed the whole way government works, there's lots that we can do if we approach it in the right way. But, to be clear, the ambition of the regulators in Europe should be, yes, to prevent harm, but also to enable good and to make sure that we're creating an environment in which Europe is able to compete with the best in the world. Now, there are some good signs. I mean, for the first time this year, I think that the amount of investment flowing into new technology topped $100 billion. You've got, roughly 100 unicorns being created in Europe, many of them actually in the UK. So there's a lot happening. And there's some very good stuff happening, but we need to be, on top of it.
Yeah, I often hear from policymakers that regulation is giving Europe a competitive edge, but I'm not really sure how that translates into growth and job. I think having, legal frameworks that are clear so you can grow your business, so you know what the rules are and what they're not, is helpful. But I think the focus can sometimes be a bit skewed, which is quite interesting because this year's report and Politico, they did some research on US big tech being the single most frequently talked about tech-related term with European policymakers. So do you think that Europe is perhaps focusing a little too much on handicapping competition in the US, or do you think it's really focused on enabling its own businesses?
Well, I think the risk is it is too much focused on American big tech without asking the question, why are they all American? So I think if we want to make a reality of European technology, including Britain within Europe for these purposes, you've got to make sure our environment is one that actually encourages it. And, there's no doubt that's partly about creating the right ecosystem. Mm-hmm. It's partly about, which we've done pretty well in the UK, by the way, using our universities and research centres as means of generating new technology. But it's also about creating an environment in which people feel They can found companies where there's capital available because you've got the right rules around the use of capital and what happens when people create companies. So no, I think absolutely there is a strong risk that Europe ends up fearing the big American giants, which, you know, I understand for the reasons people have for that, and there are all sorts of issues to do with them. But it would be much better if we at least had equal concentration on how we enable European tech to grow.
That was one of the founding principles behind the establishment of the European Tech Alliance a couple of years ago. I was part of a different European unicorn at the time, and arriving in Brussels, I thought the red carpet would be rolled out for us because we were this great European business, but actually it was hard to get FaceTime with people, and so that's why we got together in the alliance and said, like, European tech companies need to work together to be at the table and part of these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it is a problem with the European system, and particularly with a lot of people in the European Parliament. Okay, because if you want to get publicity as a member of Parliament, you know, if you're sounding off about American technology company, you know, Facebook, Amazon, etc., Google, how powerful they are, you're not paying their right tax, and all of which are important issues, you probably think you've got a much greater chance of getting publicity than if you say we should be reforming, using technology, the European energy market so that we don't have to consume the same amount of energy, and can make use of what is obviously going to be necessary, which is a coordination of energy markets across Europe in order to reduce emissions. That's a more complicated thing to get across than, you know, Facebook's peering into your private life.
Harder to make the headlines as well. So in fairness to, I think, our colleagues in Brussels, there is a big focus on, you know, how do we create the next generation of really like internationally competitive tech companies coming out of Europe. Are there certain areas that you're particularly excited about that you think Europe might have an edge on?
I think bioscience is one. And then I think energy is another because of the huge ambitions Europe's got. Yep. I think around some things I was talking about earlier around food and the future of food and food technology. I think Europe's got lots of. I mean, it's a big market.
It's fertile ground.
Yeah, it's the biggest market. I mean, the European single market is still the biggest commercial market in the world. And I think the other thing is that it's, you know, it's got issues to do with the university sector in Europe. I think, you know, the UK is a standout in terms of, you know, if you look at the top 100 universities in the world, the UK is up there with the US. I think Europe's got it's got a way to go in terms of how it does all of that. But no, I think there are real areas, fintech probably as well, if we want to do, but that does depend on getting the regulatory system
very much so
right. And you know, you the whole issue to do with digital services, digital currency, you know, these are going to be massive questions, and it will depend. You know, to the point we started with, it will depend a lot on what the regulatory environment is.
Yeah. So speaking of digital currency, question about crypto. So in June this year, El Salvador passed a law making it the first country in the world to accept Bitcoin as legal tender. This was news to me. So more recently, they've actually announced plans to construct a Bitcoin city near a volcano that will be funded solely by cryptocurrency. So how much do you think crypto will play in the future of European tech? And we often obsess about, obviously, the US and China, which we've talked about, but should we be looking to places like El Salvador for inspiration?
So this is where, you know, although I talk a lot about the importance of technology, I'm aware that there's a certain point at which my knowledge falls short. You were mentioning my son and daughter-in-law earlier. When I asked my son to explain crypto and blockchain to me, he did, and I said, I'm not really getting it. So he sent me something called The Idiot's Guide to Blockchain. And I struggled with that too.
Sounds quite useful, actually.
But blockchain for sure has got a huge future and is obviously used a lot. And cryptocurrencies, I mean, I think there are thousands now of companies involved in cryptocurrencies, and it's $2.6 trillion worth of assets in it. I mean, the only thing I think is that there's going to come a point when, again, regulation, when it becomes systemically important, the regulators are going to step in. Yep. And I think the interest that there is in digital currencies, and we've suggested that we have a digital pound, and I'm sure countries will move in that direction. I think you just can't be sure where cryptocurrencies will then fit into it, because of course they're all based on the idea that you cut out the government. Yeah. And that's fine until the government decides it doesn't want to be cut out.
Exactly, and I think there's the complexity is an issue, right? When most people, I think, who use the internet don't understand what they're using, we see the same on a different level with online advertising and targeted advertising. Most people don't truly understand the processes involved, and obviously Brussels is concerned about that, understandably, and that's why they're looking at things potentially to regulate advertising online. So it's a case of if most people using certain technology don't understand it, policymakers will often feel the need to step in.
Yes, for sure. And also people are investing money, retail investors. And I mean, look, the world will go cashless. I'm pretty sure about that. And I think there is, I can see this even in the countries we work in Africa, where Fintech is actually accelerating quite fast now. And then I think with cryptocurrencies, I think some of the principles behind it and what people are trying to do, which is really based on a distrust for reasons that are understandable, in many cases justifiable, of state regulators and public policymakers. I think some of the principles behind it will definitely endure, and that's why blockchain is so interesting to people, because it does give you a trusted authenticity in transactions. So all of this I think is really important. What I just don't, I'm not expert enough or knowledgeable enough yet to see is how public regulators respond to crypto when it becomes something that's, impacting everyone's daily life.
Well, perhaps the point then is that those involved in building businesses around crypto need to be engaging now to help these audiences understand.
That is for sure. Otherwise, they're going to suddenly find they're stuck out there.
Yeah, and there'll be concern and worry and fear rather than actually interest and curiosity.
Yes, because I'm sure many of the people involved in these endeavors want to do that. They're motivated by doing good and not just doing well. But in that case, they need to explain to people who are public policymakers what they're trying to do, the right way to regulate it, the right way to set it within the overall financial system.
Right. So final question. Obviously, you talk about your institute is working a lot on these tech issues, and it's working a lot across Africa as well. Do you see a lot, I think there's a lot of really interesting companies and businesses and ideas emerging from that continent. Is there anything in particular that you're excited about that you think we should be taking note of?
Well, I think just to take note of the fact it is exploding.
Yeah.
And, the numbers of startup companies in Africa is growing exponentially all the time, including unicorn companies. And what's interesting is the potential that these companies have to alter the way that the countries work and that public services get developed. And so we're working in roughly 20 different countries in Africa. One of the things we're working on specifically is how we use technology to accelerate that development. And what we're finding is, having started with the idea, well, there are tech companies in the developed world that it would be great to bring to Africa, and we're doing a lot of that. We're also now finding, no, there are tech companies in Africa, started in Africa by Africans, that we should be partnering with. Now, at the moment, I think for a lot of policymakers in Africa, the knowledge is even further behind.
Right.
But they've got to catch up. And things like how you generate and then use data in some of these countries around issues like healthcare, I think, are of enormous importance. And that's one area we're particularly interested in, is how you will probably have in the future adult vaccination programs, not just for COVID, but for a series of different diseases that means you should have a system where you can register those vaccinations, follow them up with the patient. You will generate a huge amount of data that could be immensely valuable for people.
Population level health data is something no one's gotten right yet.
Right, but I think it's a massive area. We're really interested in it. And then you will also find you get these startup companies beginning in Africa that are going to be, I think, quite revolutionary. And in financial payments, for example, I mean, Kenya was in many ways ahead of a lot of the Western world. So, it's a very exciting area. And the other thing I always say to people engaged in building technology companies is think about the developing world, because sometimes, by the way, you'll find a readier audience for what you're doing than you will in the West, because part of the problem when you're disrupting things is that, and this is what anyone knows who's ever tried to reform anything in government, is a whole lot of vested interests come out and stop you proceeding with the reform. Whereas in some of the developing countries, it's a virgin market. They're interested in new ideas, and that they'll give them a welcome if they can see what they can do.
Yeah, focus on the outcome rather than, I suppose, trying to roll back years and years of heavy regulation. Tony, thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tom and Sarah, back to you.
Thank you so much to both of you. It's not often you get to see such a complex issue explored with this level of insider's knowledge. Before we sign off, you should know that there is much more to explore. The new State of European Tech website has just launched, which has all the data we've talked about today, and will be updated with new information and commentary over the coming year.
Thank you to everyone who made this year's report and today's launch event so rich with valuable insights, from Brixton Village in South London to the Codam Coding College in Amsterdam, from Klarna's headquarters in Stockholm to Wolt's head office in Helsinki. Our aim was to transport you to a few of the places where inspirational people are doing extraordinary things, and we appreciate the warm welcome, the wise words, and the food for thought that you shared with us. And thank you also to everyone behind the scenes at Atomico, Good Love, Milltown Partners, AIMSEER, and MediaWorks. You all made today possible.
And a final thank you to you. There are a lot of big numbers in this year's report, but the success of Europe's tech ecosystem is really down to people who have the passion, patience, and persistence to build something that makes a meaningful difference in our lives. People like you. So we hope you've enjoyed sharing this with us.
Goodbye, and thank you so much for tuning in.
And see you next year. Goodbye.
Thank you.